Cold rain poured down on the empty bus stop. A teenage girl sat in her wheelchair, shivering as she clutched a torn backpack, her eyes vacant and hollow. Passersby glanced her way but quickly looked away, hurrying past. A middle-aged man walking with his young daughter was about to do the same. His daughter tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, she can't walk home. Can we help her?" The father looked into those cold, wet eyes. He knelt down gently and said 3 simple words, "Come with me." Those 3 words would change all of their lives forever. Daniel Reed stood at 39, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of maintenance work. His worn jacket and faded jeans told the story of a man who worked with his hands, fixing what others broke, cleaning up what others left behind. His 8-year-old daughter Emily bounced beside him, humming a melody only she could hear. She clutched her favorite fabric doll, a threadbare companion that had seen better days, but remained precious beyond measure. Life hadn't been kind to the Reed family. 3 years ago, cancer had taken Daniel's wife, Sarah, leaving him to navigate single parenthood while working 2 jobs to make ends meet. He cleaned office buildings at night and did maintenance repairs during the day, sleeping in between when he could. The neighbors in their modest apartment complex weren't shy about their opinions. "That man can barely take care of his own daughter," Mrs. Patterson from 3B whispered to her friend. "Always looks exhausted, always behind on something." "I heard he works nights," came the response. "That poor little girl, home alone so much." Daniel heard the whispers but chose to ignore them. He focused instead on teaching Emily what really mattered: kindness over judgment, compassion over comfort. This particular afternoon, they were walking home from Emily's school when the rain began. Daniel pulled his thin jacket tighter, wishing he could afford proper winter coats for both of them. The bus stop shelter came into view, and that's when they saw her. A girl, maybe 15 or 16, sat motionless in a wheelchair that had seen better days. Her hands were curled awkwardly in her lap, the unmistakable sign of paralysis. Rain dripped through the broken shelter roof onto her thin jacket. People walked past without slowing down. A businessman checked his phone and stepped around her wheelchair like it was an obstacle. A woman with shopping bags glanced once and quickened her pace. Emily stopped walking. She stared at the girl with the direct curiosity of childhood, untainted by adult discomfort. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging Daniel's sleeve. "She can't walk home. She's all wet and cold." Daniel felt that familiar tug in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he'd found an injured bird in their courtyard last month. Emily had insisted they help it heal, even though they barely had money for their own groceries. He looked at the girl again. She couldn't have been much older than Emily would be in a few years. Where was her family? How long had she been sitting there? "Excuse me," Daniel said softly, approaching the wheelchair. "Are you waiting for someone?" The girl looked up with startled eyes, as if she'd forgotten people could see her. Her lips moved slightly, but no words came out. Daniel knelt down to her eye level, his maintenance uniform getting wet from the puddles. "Do you have somewhere to go? Someone to call?" Tears mixed with raindrops on the girl's face as she shook her head almost imperceptibly. Emily stepped forward without hesitation. She took off her small pink raincoat, the one Daniel had saved for months to buy her, and gently placed it over the girl's lap. "Now you're part of our family too," Emily said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess. Daniel felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. Here was his daughter, who had so little, offering what she had to a stranger. He looked into the girl's frightened eyes and made a decision that would change everything. "Would you like to come home with us?" he asked gently. "At least until the rain stops." For the first time, something flickered in those hollow eyes. Hope, fragile and tentative, but real. Daniel stood and took hold of the wheelchair handles. "Come with me." The walk to their apartment building was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of rain and wheelchair wheels on wet pavement. Daniel pushed carefully, avoiding puddles and bumps, while Emily chatted softly to their new companion about her doll's adventures. The girl finally spoke in a whisper so soft, Daniel almost missed it. "Why are you helping me? People usually avoid me." Daniel paused at a crosswalk, meeting her eyes in the reflection of a shop window. Because everyone needs a warm place when it's raining, and my daughter has a good heart. She gets that from her mother. What's your name? Emily asked, walking beside the wheelchair like an appointed guardian. Sophie, came the barely audible reply. Sophie Martinez. I'm 16. I'm Emily, and that's my daddy, Daniel. Do you like grilled cheese? Daddy makes the best grilled cheese when it rains. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor, no elevator. Daniel had carried Emily up these stairs when she'd broken her ankle 2 years ago, but a wheelchair presented a different challenge. I can stay down here, Sophie said, noticing his hesitation. Absolutely not, Daniel replied. He studied the wheelchair, then gently lifted Sophie in his arms. Emily, can you fold the chair and drag it up? We'll come back for it if it's too heavy. Emily attacked the task with determination, wrestling the wheelchair, while Daniel carried Sophie up 3 flights of stairs. By the time they reached apartment 3A, all 3 were breathing hard, but they were laughing too. The apartment was small, tiny really, but clean and warm. Emily's drawings covered the refrigerator, and the smell of yesterday's soup still lingered in the air. Sophie looked around with wonder, as if she'd entered a palace instead of a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. When did you last eat? Daniel asked, settling Sophie on the couch and covering her with their only good blanket. Another sacrifice he made without thinking. Sophie's face crumbled. Yesterday morning, I think, before my mom's boyfriend said. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Daniel understood. He'd worked enough jobs in rough neighborhoods to recognize the signs of abandonment, of a child being treated like a burden instead of a blessing. Grilled cheese coming right up, he said simply, heading to the kitchen. Emily curled up next to Sophie on the couch, showing her the family photo that sat on the side table. Daniel, Emily, and Sarah from happier times. That's my mama, Emily explained. She's in heaven now, but Daddy says she still watches over us. Maybe she sent us to find you today. Sophie stared at the photo, tears flowing freely now. I haven't had anyone watch over me in a long time. Well, you do now, Emily declared with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. That's what families do. Daniel returned with sandwiches and hot soup, watching as Sophie ate like she hadn't seen food in days, which he realized she probably hadn't. Sophie, he said gently, do you have somewhere to go tonight? Someone we should call? Sophie's face hardened. My mom remarried. Her new husband says I'm too much trouble. They moved to a new house, and there wasn't room for my wheelchair. She left me at this group home, but I ran away. I've been living in the bus shelter for 3 days. The casual way she delivered this devastating information broke Daniel's heart. How could a mother abandon her child? How could anyone look at this brave, broken girl and see only burden? You can stay here tonight, he said. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. But word traveled fast in their building. By evening, Mrs. Patterson was knocking on their door with barely concealed concern and curiosity. Daniel, honey, some of the neighbors are talking. They saw you bring that girl home and well, she lowered her voice. A single man living with a strange, disabled child? People might get the wrong idea. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. What kind of wrong idea, Mrs. Patterson? You know how people talk, and that girl, she's not your responsibility. There are places for people like her, programs. There are programs for abandoned children, yes, Daniel interrupted. But Sophie isn't going anywhere tonight. She's safe here. She's fed, and she's welcome. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from concern to judgment. Daniel, you can barely manage with Emily. Taking on another child, especially one with special needs? It's not fair to Emily. Emily appeared in the doorway, having heard every word. Sophie is nice, she said firmly. And she likes my drawings. She's staying. After Mrs. Patterson left, shaking her head in disapproval, Daniel found Sophie crying quietly on the couch. I shouldn't have come, she whispered. I'm causing problems for you. Daniel sat beside her, careful not to crowd her space. Sophie, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not a problem. You're not a burden. You are a 16-year-old girl who deserves a safe place to sleep and people who care about you. Emily climbed onto the couch between them, offering Sophie her precious fabric doll. Here, she protects people from bad dreams. That night, Daniel gave Sophie his bed and slept on the couch. Through the thin walls, he could hear Emily chattering away to their new housemate, telling stories and sharing secrets like they'd known each other for years. For the first time in months, the apartment felt full instead of empty. But Daniel knew that outside these walls, people were already talking. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, harder questions, and the kind of scrutiny that single fathers knew all too well. He just hoped he was strong enough to protect both his daughters from what was coming. Over the following days, Sophie slowly revealed her story in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that cut even as they reflected the truth. She'd been a dancer before the accident. Car crash at 14, drunk driver who walked away while she was airlifted to trauma surgery. The doctors had been honest. She would never walk again. My mom was so proud of me before, Sophie said one afternoon while Emily colored at the kitchen table. I was going to audition for performing arts school. After the accident, she looked at me like I had died in that crash. Daniel continued folding laundry, giving Sophie space to speak without the pressure of direct attention. She met Rick 6 months later. He was nice at first, but then he started talking about starting fresh and how hard it was to have a disabled kid around. Mom started agreeing with him. Emily looked up from her coloring book. That's dumb. You're not hard to have around. You help me with my homework and you make funny voices when we read stories. Sophie smiled through her tears, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her. Thanks, Em. The breaking point came at the end of their first week together. Daniel was at work when Rick and Sophie's mother, Carmen, arrived at the apartment. Emily had called Daniel in a panic. Daddy, there's a mean man here saying Sophie has to go with him. Daniel dropped his tools and ran 6 blocks, arriving to find Sophie pressed against the living room wall in her wheelchair, while Rick loomed over her. You can't just take in random kids, Rick was shouting. She's not your responsibility. Carmen stood behind him, avoiding eye contact with her daughter. The woman who had once driven Sophie to dance classes now couldn't even look at her. Sophie is my responsibility now, Daniel said firmly, stepping between them in the wheelchair. She's safe here, she's cared for, and she's staying, Rick laughed cruelly. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a maintenance worker who can barely afford this dump. What can you give her that we can't? Daniel felt Emily slip her hand into his, drawing strength from his daughter's unwavering support. I can give her what you already took away, Daniel said quietly. A home where she's wanted. Carmen finally spoke, her voice hollow. Sophie, baby, we found a nice facility. They have programs, therapists, other kids like you. Other broken kids, you mean? Sophie's voice was stronger than Daniel had heard it before. Other kids whose families threw them away? That's not, Carmen started. Yes, it is. Sophie's composure cracked completely. You left me in a bus shelter, Mom. Your own daughter. You chose him over me, and now you want me to pretend some institution will love me the way you stopped loving me. The silence that followed was deafening. Rick tried a different approach. Look, buddy, I get it. You want to be the good guy. But this girl has medical needs, special requirements. You're not equipped. I have diabetes, Emily said suddenly. All the adults turned to her. Daddy gives me shots every day and checks my sugar and never complains. He learned everything the doctors taught him. He can learn about wheelchairs, too. Daniel's heart swelled with pride and broke with love simultaneously. His 8-year-old daughter was defending their makeshift family with more courage than most adults possessed. Sophie's not going anywhere, Daniel said with finality. If you want to be part of her life, you're welcome to visit, but I won't let you abandon her again. Carmen started to cry, the weight of her choices finally hitting her. I thought Rick said it would be better for everyone if you threw away your daughter like garbage? Daniel's voice was steel. How exactly is that better for Sophie? The confrontation might have escalated, but Mrs. Chen from apartment 2C chose that moment to knock on the door. She'd been grocery shopping and had extras, she said, but Daniel suspected she'd been listening and decided to intervene. "Oh," she said, taking in the scene. "I didn't realize Sophie had visitors. She's such a sweet girl. Been helping my grandson with his math homework. We're so lucky Daniel found her." More neighbors began appearing, drawn by the raised voices but staying to support what had become an impromptu family defense. Mr. Johnson from downstairs brought his son, who Emily had been teaching to draw. Mrs. Martinez from the end of the hall arrived with her daughter, who Sophie had been reading to in Spanish. What Rick had intended as an intimidation had become a demonstration of community support. "This is ridiculous," Rick muttered, but his bluster was fading. "Carmen, we need to go." Carmen looked at Sophie one last time, and for a moment, Daniel saw the mother she used to be. The woman who had celebrated her daughter's dance recitals and kissed her scraped knees. "I'm sorry," she whispered, then turned and followed Rick out the door. Sophie stared at the closed door for a long moment, then looked at Daniel with eyes that held both devastation and determination. "She chose him," Sophie said simply. "Yes," Daniel replied honestly. "She did, and that's her loss, not yours. But she's my mom. She gave birth to you," Emily said with the blunt wisdom of childhood. "But moms don't leave their kids in the rain. Dads don't either." That evening, as Daniel tucked Emily into her bed, she asked the question that had been building all week. "Daddy, is Sophie really going to stay? Forever?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing his daughter's hair. "Do you want her to stay?" "Yes. She's my sister now. She needs us. And we need her too," Daniel realized, speaking the truth as he discovered it. "She makes our family complete." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a local reporter who had heard about the situation from one of their neighbors. The story that emerged wasn't the one Daniel expected. "Single father opens home to abandoned teen," read the headline. But the article focused on something deeper. The definition of family in a world where blood relationships could be broken and chosen bonds could prove stronger than genetics. The response was overwhelming. The community that had once whispered about Daniel's struggles now rallied around his courage. And Sophie, for the first time in 2 years, began to believe she might actually belong somewhere. The newspaper article sparked something unexpected in their small community. Within days, Daniel's phone was ringing with offers of help, donations, and support from strangers who had been moved by their story. A local medical supply company donated a new, lightweight wheelchair for Sophie. A physical therapy clinic offered free sessions. The community college reached out about enrollment options for Sophie to finish her high school equivalency. But the most meaningful changes were smaller, more personal. Mrs. Patterson, who had initially questioned Daniel's decision, appeared at their door with a casserole and an apology. "I was wrong," she said simply. Sophie brightens up the whole hallway with her smile. The kids in the building, led by Emily's fearless example, had adopted Sophie as everyone's big sister. She helped with homework, refereed playground disputes, and taught origami to anyone interested. "Look, Daddy," Emily announced one afternoon, bursting through the door with 3 other children in tow. "Sophie taught us to make paper cranes. She says if we make 1,000, we can make a wish come true." Sophie wheeled in behind them, laughing as kids scattered to retrieve fallen paper birds. Her face had filled out from regular meals, and her eyes held light that hadn't been there before. "What wish would you make?" Daniel asked her later as they cleaned up the craft supplies. Sophie paused, a half-folded crane in her hands. "I used to wish I could walk again, but now, I think I'd wish for you and Emily to always be this happy. You saved my life, Daniel." "You saved ours too," he replied honestly. "Emily needed a sister, and I needed to remember what it felt like to make a difference." The biggest transformation came when the local high school's principal, Dr. Williams, visited their apartment. She'd read the article and wanted to discuss Sophie's educational options. We can provide accessibility accommodations, she explained, sitting across from Sophie at their small kitchen table. Wheelchair access, modified PE classes, extra time for assignments if needed. But I have to be honest. Most of our experience with disabled students has been with kids who had family support systems. Sophie has a family support system, Emily interjected from her spot on the couch, where she was supposedly doing homework but clearly eavesdropping. Us, Dr. Williams smiled. Yes, I can see that. Sophie, would you be interested in joining our junior class in January? We have an excellent art program, and I understand you have some background in performance. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but for once they were happy tears. I'd love that. I haven't been to real school since the accident. Daniel watched his daughter because that's what Sophie had become, light up with possibility. When was the last time anyone had offered her a future instead of just management? The enrollment process led to another unexpected development. The school's drama teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, visited their apartment to discuss adaptive performance techniques. We're planning a spring production of Our Town, she explained. It's a play about the importance of everyday moments, about appreciating life as it happens. I think you might connect with those themes. Sophie had been quiet during most of the conversation, but suddenly she sat up straighter in her wheelchair. Would there be a part for someone like me? There would be a part for someone exactly like you, Ms. Rodriguez said warmly. Theater isn't about perfect bodies. It's about authentic emotions and genuine stories. You have more authentic story than most adults I know. That evening, Sophie stayed up late reading the play script, her face animated with an excitement Daniel hadn't seen since she'd arrived. Listen to this, she said, reading aloud. Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute? That's what Emily does, isn't it? She realizes every minute. Daniel nodded, watching Emily sleep peacefully on the couch, curled up with her fabric doll and one of Sophie's origami cranes. She taught me to do that too, he admitted. Before you both came into my life, I was just surviving. Now I'm living. A month later, Daniel received an offer that tested everything they'd built together. The owner of the maintenance company where he worked had been following their story and offered Daniel a promotion, supervisor of a new branch across town with a significant pay raise and benefits. It would mean a bigger apartment, Daniel explained to both girls that evening. Better schools, more opportunities. But we'd have to leave here? Emily asked, looking around their tiny apartment that had somehow become perfect. We'd leave the neighbors who helped us, Sophie added quietly. Mrs. Chen, who brings us soup when I have physical therapy. Mr. Johnson, who fixed my wheelchair brake. All the kids who fold cranes with us. Daniel realized that success wasn't just about money or bigger apartments. It was about community, belonging, and the people who chose to love you. What if I counteroffered? He said slowly. What if I asked them to let me manage the maintenance for this building and 3 others in the neighborhood? We could stay here, I could make more money, and we wouldn't lose our community. Emily clapped her hands. Yes, that's perfect. Sophie smiled, but Daniel saw something deeper in her expression. Gratitude, not just for the practical solution, but for being included in the decision, for being treated like family. Family isn't blood, she said softly, echoing Emily's words from weeks earlier. It's who stays. 1 year later, on a sunny afternoon that felt like a miracle after so many storms, Sophie sat on their fire escape with Emily, both of them folding origami cranes from colorful paper. They'd reached 847 cranes so far, hanging in careful chains from their ceiling like paper prayers. Emily insisted they needed exactly 1,000 to make their wish come true, while Sophie had begun to believe their wish had already been granted. Sophie, Emily said, concentrating on a particularly tricky fold, do you still miss dancing? Sophie paused, considering the question that used to feel like a knife in her chest. I miss it, she said honestly, but I found something else. Did you know that in the school play, I help direct the movement? I can see the whole stage from my chair, so I help other kids find their positions and their emotions. That's like dancing with your brain instead of your feet, Emily observed with her usual startling insight. Exactly like that, Sophie laughed. Daniel appeared in the window, home from work with paint smudges on his shirt, evidence of the building improvements he'd been overseeing. His small maintenance business had grown to serve 6 apartment complexes, and he'd hired 2 assistants, including Mr. Johnson's son, who was learning the trade. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, settling beside them on the fire escape that had been reinforced and decorated with flower boxes. Sophie's idea, Emily's execution. "We're planning Sophie's graduation party," Emily announced. Sophie had not only finished high school but had been accepted to community college with a scholarship for students who had overcome significant challenges. "And my celebration dinner too," Sophie added. The state had finally approved Daniel as her legal guardian, a process that had taken months but had given them all the security they'd never dared to hope for. Daniel pulled both girls into a hug that somehow fit perfectly on the narrow fire escape. "Your mom would be so proud," he told Emily, as he did every day. Then, turning to Sophie, "And your mom missed out on the most incredible daughter." Sophie had heard from Carmen twice in the past year, awkward phone calls where her mother tried to explain choices that couldn't be explained. Sophie had been gracious but distant, focusing instead on the family that had chosen to love her completely. "I wrote something for you," Sophie said suddenly, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "I've been working on it for our anniversary." She unfolded a poem written in her careful handwriting. "You found me broken at a bus stop, rain-soaked and forgotten, but you saw something worth saving where others saw only burden. Emily, you shared your raincoat and declared me family before you even knew my name. Daniel, you carried me up 3 flights and never looked back. I came to you with nothing but wheelchair tracks and tears. You gave me home, hope, and healing, the holy trinity of love. Thank you for teaching me that family isn't blood, but the people who say, 'Come with me,' when you have nowhere left to go." Daniel wiped his eyes unashamedly. Emily applauded and immediately demanded to hear it again so she could memorize it. As the sun set over their small corner of the city, painting their fire escape in golden light, Sophie looked at her chosen family and felt something she thought was lost forever, complete belonging. "I love you both," she said simply. "We love you too," Emily replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Daniel squeezed them both tighter, forever and always. Below them, the neighborhood continued its evening routine. Kids playing in the courtyard, neighbors calling greetings to each other, Mrs. Chen hanging laundry while humming old songs. Their story had started with 3 words in the rain. "Come with me." But it continued every day with 3 different words, spoken and unspoken, in a dozen small acts of love. "You belong here." And Sophie finally, completely, beautifully did. If you believe in stories where love builds families beyond blood, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.